Yeah, thanks, Max, for the introduction. And yeah, you've said lots of the things I wanted to say about kind of myself and the start of the project, really. I'll dwell on the first screen because I put the picture there, a few of the old photos that I took and my daughter took during my own experience of lockdown homeschooling. So the various work that we were doing to upload to the school's app to show the teacher what we were doing, and the various walks we did in the park, and her cute little purple boots that she was wearing during all of COVID. So yeah, so like Max said, the experience of homeschooling myself prompted me to want to do this study as well as my sort of academic interests. Yeah, I'm saying hello from University of Warwick. So involvement and engagement in education. It focuses on fathers then obviously specifically, but it also talks about how fathers engage with or are unable to engage with other services as well, health services, family services, issues of parental leave policy, and those sorts of things as well. So it sits within BA education program, but it attracts lots of other students from across social sciences as well. So teaching on that module, as well as my own experience, developed this research project that's I've put a screenshot of the project page there. So during COVID, an opportunity to research father's experience at the time, but then it also, once things got back to some sort of normality, the new normal, clearly the question of the legacy of that father involvement was important as well. So, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, really. So from a bit of background to start off with, a bit of context and a little bit of literature and theorizing before we get to think about the data from the project. So yeah, as I said, and as Max said, the schools closing to most pupils represented this opportunity to look at fathers' educational involvement when typically we've a sense that dads can't be as involved because they're just less often to be at home if they're, for example, working when their children are needing their help, for example, around homework and so on. So everybody back at home together typically represented an opportunity to understand that involvement. And the research around how that played out, the different roles that mothers and fathers took in families is interesting during the COVID lockdown, different kind of shifting arrangements in terms of the domestic labour. And I think some of the research confirms that there was initially a bit of an equalising of that domestic responsibility, but then as the lockdowns went on and as we were into second and third lockdowns, some of those more sort of typical gendered patterns of domestic labour fell back into place again. So steps forward, but also steps back into those sort of more traditional roles. Of course, also what was happening is changing teaching practices. Teachers were having to create new materials, new resources, having to engage with their pupils and their parents in a really different way. So we kind of have teachers doing different things at that end of things, as well as families doing different things as well. And the question is really then, they were doing different homeschooled interactions, different relationships, and has that played forward into what's happening now also? That's a question to ask. As we kind of came out of the COVID lockdowns and so on, there was an increasing set of calls for more flexible working and more care-friendly working. And we'll see in some of the data that I'll present that workplaces change policies to allow more flexible working, and often the dads in this study for sure talked about how beneficial that has been. So that was a changing thing as well. And increasingly, and whilst it's not kind of perhaps frontline always, but increasingly lots more of research and thinking about how dad's involvement makes a difference, how it actually looks, the effect that has on children's development, and also in practice as well. So lots of work around how can services evolve what they do to more better involve fathers and meet them where they're at. So there was all of that kind of background as well. In terms of context, in terms of kind of thinking about why dads and why their involvement in education. So, and this will be a sort of familiar theme perhaps from many of the sessions in the Glasgow University webinar series, that when we're talking about parental involvement, talking about parental engagement, or the default really is mothers in that context, because mothers tend to be positioned as responsible for their children's educational success. The sort of ideals of intensive parenting fall disproportionately onto mothers. It's ideal of what sort of good motherhood looks like equals ensuring your children's educational success in part. And so we've got that along with these gendered family norms about who does what sort of care around for their children, as well as these parental leave policies that set dads up to be the helper from the very beginning, rather than sort of fully involved often. So, and we'll talk about kind of perhaps some of the consequences of that being the helper, not being the kind of the prime parent in that respect. I think it's relevant to say that early years in primary schooling tends to be coded as quite female domains. You know, it's kind of a daytime sort of activity. There's this nurture and development focus. Not many male teachers. It can feel quite a female environment. So all of that, I think, means that mothers tend to be the gatekeepers to their children's schooling, and dads are kind of the secondary parent in that respect. And research around this talks about how dads are often, even when they're highly engaged in their children's development more generally, in their children's lives more generally, they still tend to be the educational labourer rather than the educational executive. Research from Brooks and Hodgkinson talk about that idea that mothers still retain this overall responsibility, even when perhaps the mums aren't the kind of prime day-to-day carer in those sort of relationships. So the other factor, and this is a theme from the webinars as well, I know that when parental involvement is seen as school-centred rather than about the learning that goes on and the engagement with the learning at home, that tends to privilege that sort of involvement rather than involvement that's a bit further away from that school life aspect. So therefore, altogether, we've got consequences for how dads are positioned in relation to their primary age children's education and schooling. So we wanted to explore that and kind of find out more on that. So a little bit more background before we get into the data that I collected. So there's a big study done by researchers at Leeds, Helen Norman in conjunction with Jonathan Davies, who's CEO, I think, of the Fatherhood Institute in the UK. They did a project using the Millennium Cohort study data and found that dads do indeed make a difference to their children's education, and specifically in these structured activities. That really does play out as an advantage in children's first year of primary school when dads are doing that. And an interesting part of their findings was that benefit is sort of incremental on top of what mothers' involvement brings. So and they found in this study that mums tend to make a difference to the sort of cognitive behaviours for learning. So things like how to socialize best, how to interact, how to regulate emotions, how to kind of be quiet when you're meant to be quiet, and kind of those sorts of things that help those kids move into primary education. Whereas dads seem to make a difference. Their involvement on top of that seems to make a difference when it comes to sort of how well they're doing academically in those early years of primary school. And then I hypothesized that could be for a couple of reasons. It could be that just having another parent around makes the difference. So, you know, person with a different personality, different parenting style, bringing different vocabularies, different behaviors, just stimulates the child's cognitive development in a different way. But also that there may be a specifically gendered aspect to that as well, that dads maybe play differently with their kids, that kind of sort of typical, perhaps stereotypical assumption about rough and tumble play that dads might do compared to mums. And some of that comes out in what I'll talk about in a bit, the way that dads seem to want to do education involvement a little bit differently. So this study kind of asked those questions, really. What is it that's kind of making that incremental benefit of dad's involvement? Yeah, the other thing before we get into a bit of data really is trying to put a frame around that, a bit of theory on that. And so I really like Sung-Won Kim's model of paternal involvement in their children's education. And if you're familiar with this, you'll see that what Kim has done is taken elements from the Hoover, Dempsey and Sandler model of parental involvement and sort of mash that together with the research that is more specifically focused on father involvement more broadly than education. And that's the responsibility, engagement, and accessibility part. So Kim's put these together and tried to kind of make sense of how father involvement plus the parental engagement and involvement work together. And in particular, I want to highlight this parental role construction thing as really relevant in what I found in my data. So it's key for both mums and dads, but we're talking about dads specifically, that what you think your role is educationally as a parent is vital to what then you actually go ahead and do with your children. Kind of sounds pretty straightforward and clear that would be the case. The particular point about dads is that that role is really much more malleable. So it's not a given. And the key thing is the degree to which they are receiving and responding to invitations from others is really, really important. This is what this theoretical model suggests based on parental involvement models that they've kind of used to draw into this. So, for example, from the father's partner, from the school itself, from the teachers, from the child, you're invited to take part. It kind of plays into that sense that, okay, I should be doing this role and I'll then take it on. So dad's role is really malleable and it can shape the sense that what they should be doing when it comes to educational engagement and involvement. And then that plays up into what they actually do then, maybe school involvement and maybe home involvement and maybe academic socialization, the things at the top of the model there. And I've highlighted academic socialization, and that's the bit which is taking a bit of a wider view than let's get the homework done. So let's have a discussion about what you want to, why this is beneficial and how you might apply this in the real world, or it's really good to keep studying because you might be able to get a job in this area, or you might be able to, do this as for a living. Talking about strategies, talking about resilience, talking about kind of being motivated, and all of those sorts of things that build the foundations to children's educational success. And I'm highlighting that because I think that comes out in my data as well as an area that is really important that dads say they're doing more of, essentially. Okay, so I'm kind of trying to kind of refer to this as I go. So I paused for a drink whilst I briefly introduced the sample and what I did. So yeah, phase one was an online survey, and this was a few months after the beginning of the lockdown in the UK, worldwide in March. So a few months into that, I opened an online survey for dads of primary school age children, asking about their homeschooling experience, and got 68 responses for that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that data, but I'll focus on phase two, which I'll tell you about in more detail, which came sort of 3 to 4 years after that. So I'll quickly introduce the data from phase one initially and lead that into the second one. So yeah, first thing I wanted to just indicate is who was in that sample. That sample of 68 people who answered that first survey. So quite a narrow sample and limited. So I'm kind of putting that caveat out there now, really, that people who answered this survey were almost all white, almost all pretty well educated in sort of professional white collar sort of jobs of the age you might expect for being dads of primary school age children, that 30 to 50 group, and most were living in heterosexual relationships, with their partners, with their kids at home. So it is talking about quite a specific group of dads. We had bring up a couple of bit more information, but I won't dwell on it. That I did in this sample, I've got a good combination of people who either weren't working at that time because perhaps they lost their job, people who were working full-time, and also people working at home full-time as well. And that seems key when it comes to this homeschooling. So yeah, some quite basic data just to kind of get us into thinking about this. So one of the questions was your experience of homeschooling, and tick these boxes. So we see quite a mixed bag, and I think that was true from all of the sorts of questions I asked in this survey, that it's on the one hand terribly difficult, and on the other hand actually one of the greatest things we've done as a family. This really kind of mixture of things that parents, that dads in the survey are talking about. It's really tough, but actually I got a lot out of it, that kind of feeling from this data. So yeah, we've got there a lot of the dads saying it caused tension between me and my kids, caused tension between me and my partner. I had to prioritize paid work, those sorts of things. But some key things about, the very top answer was, I've learned more about my children. So that sense that they're kind of building those relationships during that period of lockdown homeschooling. But as well, when we're thinking about the education, we've got dads saying really clearly, more than a third of them saying, I understand better what my children are meant to be doing at school now. Really, and I think that's key. And it's, in terms of the legacy, we see that kind of coming through 3 to 4 years later as well, that how much that made a difference to how they talk about their involvement in their children's education. So yeah, a mixed bag, but we really see some things positively shifting when it comes to the educational involvement. The other question was, what are you doing now more, you're in lockdown, than you were before? So we get the typical things we'd expect from that choice of items on this question. They're doing schoolwork, they're going outside and doing walks, they're playing games, they're doing maths, etc. But they've picked out a couple of areas that they're a little bit lower down the list, but still we've got 40% or more of the dads agreeing that they're having these conversations with their children around building confidence, building resilience, talking about why it's important to keep going and try hard, why it's important to do well in education, and talking about the learning they've done. So that typifies that academic socialization thing. So we see in lockdown these dads in this sample talking about doing both the practical hands-on things that they needed to get done, but also entering into that world of academic socialization increasingly, more than they were before. That's what they're saying there. Also on this last bit of data from the survey, I think this is quite key in terms of what the survey data can tell us. So what I asked the dads in the survey was, before they even thought about COVID, just rate yourself on these parenting scales. So I wanted to understand how confident they feel as parents, how effective they feel as parents. So I asked them on 6 different items, and those are the 6 listed there, and they're grouped around the paternal involvement, literature, accessibility, engagement, responsibility, those ideas. So I asked dads to rate themselves. And that gave me a chance then to look at above average and below average ratings of sort of self-efficacy, their own, how confident they feel in themselves. And what I then did with that is put them into 2 groups, those above average, those below average, and then looked at their responses to a couple of the questions. So one was how many hours they said they did of homeschooling, and then whether they took the main responsibility in their household for their children's homeschooling work. And what we see is what you perhaps expect to see, but I think the differences are quite marked, really, that those with above average confidence in their own parenting ability were doing more, or they say they're doing more homeschooling compared to those with below average. And I think really importantly, we're taking on the main responsibility, not shared responsibility, taking on main responsibility for their children's homeschooling. Now, you could say, well, are the demographics different? Were the ones who were doing more just not at work? Perhaps they weren't working, having to do a full-time job and also childcare. Were they better educated? Those sorts of things. What sort of jobs did they do? But actually, the demographics between these 2 groups are really similar. And so it is really this confidence in their own parenting ability that seems to be driving this. And I think that's feels like quite an important thing to kind of pick up on as educators who are trying to involve and engage dads more. That confidence is quite a key thing. So couple of summaries quickly from phase 1, that it's hard, but dad's saying they're doing more and doing especially this academic socialization, which is such a key and important thing. So schools can harness that, a really key thing. And we'll look at the data about the second phase and see where that went. Second thing is this point about self-efficacy or confidence in your own parenting, that it may be obvious to say that if you're more confident, then you're more likely to kind of get involved in that homeschooling. But it does suggest that if we can get more dads to feel more confident in their parenting ability, their self-efficacy, specifically around education, there's going to be an uplift in their kind of involvement. So, perhaps what could schools do around that is a question to ask. So trying to quickly move into phase 2, that's the sample, and that's what I did. So it's about 3 to 4 years after the very first lockdown. And I did interviews, and they were around about an hour long each, and it was a very similar sample to the group that completed the survey, with some differences that I'll mention. Just really quickly, just a sense of what sorts of jobs they did. So they tended to be kind of professional, white-collar sort of jobs, and there's the names I gave them. just a quick idea, and aware that I will definitely run out of time, so I'm kind of pre-summarizing the summary of this. Really, I think these three words kind of capture really this sort of 3 or 4 years after the very first lockdown, how dads are talking about the impact of that and the legacy of that. So opportunity, confidence, and recognition. So when dads, out of necessity, had the opportunity, they stepped up and they got involved in homeschooling, and they actually took it on, and taking it on drove a lot to really feel a sense of confidence that that was something they could do. And so that idea of the sort of malleable identity around educational involvement and parenting more, fathering more generally, really seems to sort of play out in that once dads were given the chance, they then went, oh yeah, okay, this is part of what I do now. I feel confident in taking on this. And then something kind of developed, I think, through that confidence, and it comes out in the interviews that I did, that they then started to recognize and be quite self-aware of the sorts of forms of the involvement and the engagement that they were doing, and aware of the fact that school perhaps wasn't aligning with how they wanted to do the engagement with their children's learning. So there was this sort of recognition, this realization that I really think this is something I could do, and I really enjoy doing it, but I'm not necessarily getting the opportunities to do that typically, and cycles back around to opportunity. Where are those opportunities now to do some of that great stuff that I really enjoyed doing before we went back to some sort of normality? So enjoy doing in the context of it's still quite hard, I suppose it's true to say. So yeah, to try and quickly skip through some of this data. So what I've done is put quite long quotations because I wanted to sort of show the voices of the dads really. But I won't kind of read them all out or go through them in detail. But yeah, first area, opportunities. So after COVID, the simple fact of many of the dads having much more flexible work schedules, whether that's formally or informally in place, has enabled the continued involvement. So both James here and Callum describing really similar situations, that if they're not picking their kids up, they're often at home at the same time as they arrive home. So they feel quite much more able now to put down their work and go and play in the garden for a bit. And that builds relationships, or have a conversation with their children about how, catching up with their news, as Callum said. So the ability to be there right after school to talk about how school's gone in that time is key. And as James articulates, that I'm building this relationship, and that's clearly going to help the relationship with helping learning and helping their education. So we see there is this ongoing opportunity to harness dads right there at the end of school often. Clearly not for all dads, but for these dads in this sample, that changing work arrangements really made a difference. And then kind of picking up on James's story into this thing about feeling more confident. So he really articulates that through the experience of homeschooling, it made a really, he just knows what his kids are meant to be doing more or less now, even though they're kind of a couple of years beyond that. And so actually through that, just through knowing, he's able to get a lot more out of them, as he says it. He's able to have a better conversation because he knows more about the sorts of learning they're doing. And Gary says something similar, and in particular, that idea of being more proactive. So he's felt much more on the front foot when it comes to engaging with his children's education. It's not a world away that it felt, I think, a bit for both of these. It's now something that's much closer to their understanding. And so they can be more proactive on the front foot. So we've kind of got the bedrock, the foundation was there for dads increasing and ongoing engagement with their children's learning. And that kind of confidence that evolved through doing homeschooling, it's interesting to think about how that came from different routes, really. So we've got examples in my interviews where that often stemmed from having a really superly structured approach from the school that really guided the fathers and the families overall, to having no support at all, and that nevertheless being a route to which they're confident. So I think it speaks to how important it is to meet dads where they are. So Frank, for example, and Frank was one of the non-resident dads in the sample, didn't live with his kids, and it was sort of a bit of tension between his former partner about the upbringing of his children. But during COVID, he had his kids with him. And he was really involved and doing lots of new stuff with his children, and it gave him confidence. He says it literally gave me confidence to get involved, to do things. But school were really not great at providing that support, and so I just did it my own way. Whereas Arjun, who, if there was an example of an intensive fatherhood in my sample, he described this he described himself as that. He said that he wouldn't do anything other than, from an extracurricular point of view, that this wasn't on the school curriculum. It's very focused on the school driving his own involvement with his children's education. So he puts this success that he sees, his homeschooling involvement, down to how great the school was at providing structure. So some structure versus, or lots of structure versus no structure at all. There's different routes into this confidence that the dads were felt. So as I said, meeting dads where they are is important. It's not a universal solution. And then into this idea of recognition, recognizing their form of involvement. So again, taking Arjun's story forward a bit. So he was very much reliant on what the school was saying should be done. But then started to take things his own way a little bit and started to feed in his own interests into that, and felt really confident in creating a schedule for his daughter throughout the homeschooling. And then things went back to normal. And he really he laments that he's lost that chance to be as involved as he was before. You know, he was there every day with her, really involved, and now, because he had that experience, having to, as he says, he had to hand it back. So it's interesting, that kind of symbolic nature of he no more has that responsibility or that work. He's giving it back to the school to take on, and he's not in touch with it anymore. And he kind of saying, well, I really want that to come back again. And Graham saying, you know, I kind of got into homeschooling and I was doing it and I was happy doing it, not as much as Arjun, but I was happy doing it. But school is so well structured and so well organized that there is absolutely I'd feel completely disempowered. I don't have any empowerment at all to engage with the school, to engage with learning, and there's no cooperative engagement at all. So these are examples of schools going back to a normality as before COVID, and then the dad saying, oh, so I'll step back then. You know, I'm not going to be involved, and I can't be involved. I don't see a way that I can now be involved. So, you know, an opportunity that's kind of slipping through the net really there. And then sort of taking forward that idea of recognition, that sort of self-awareness. David here talks about how homeschooling didn't go very well for his family at all. They would, because, and he articulates it as, we were trying to do school at home. So we tried to set up a very similar environment to what we thought school would be like. And it just failed. It just wasn't what we could do. And so we ended up not really doing homeschooling as the school was directing. But that gave us this sort of confidence to sort of say, well, we're just going to do our own thing. And this recognition arrived that why should we at home be doing the things that school do? It's my job as a parent to do the things that help my children grow and to thrive as human beings. The school can't do that in the same way that we can do it. School's job has one job and we've got a different job. So this idea of partnership and complementary roles between schools and fathers in this case, but home more generally, is coming through there. But I think the idea that he's confident to just say, we're not going to follow the school's agenda, I think is a really interesting point. And that, as I said, that sort of recognition, that realization coming through. And then kind of coming towards the end of this, really, picking up on this point of how fathers started to get into, during their homeschooling experience, doing things in their own way. So David's story, again, he says, well, I really am a keen home brewer. And so what I do is I get my daughter to come and help measure things with me. I get her to kind of think about fractions and multiplications whilst we're sort of measuring out whatever we need to measure out to make this beer at home. And so, you know, actively taking on this thought that we're going to do maths in the real world, and that's what school can't do, but I can do that. Arjun then says, well, I really love maths and science. So loads of the things I started doing once I got more confident was sciencey, maths based, and it again applied to the real world. And he says that his daughter really loved doing that with him. And And so I kind of thinking here around this idea of funds of knowledge or parental knowledge, and specifically maybe father's knowledge, this sort of a strength-based theory, thinking about what families and communities bring to the educational experience of their children. And often those sort of family knowledge, that community knowledge, is not reflected in the school curriculum and on what schools kind of talk about and encourage children to be focused on. And I'm aware that funds of knowledge comes from sort of looking at Indigenous and racialized working class cultures, often in the US and Canada. So I'm wary of sort of misappropriating the policy, the theory for understanding dads, because clearly not all of the dads fit within those groups. But I think there is something here to say about the way that this sorts of engagement and the sorts of knowledge that dads are enjoying exploring with their children feels a world away from the place of the classroom. It feels quite away from a school-centered or school-focused idea of what parental involvement is. It's much more about family learning aspect. And then we got Frank again, and sort of to make that point really, Frank and then Graham. Frank saying, I did loads of stuff during COVID, and it was kind of an example from COVID, loads of stuff, and it was a bit different to what school was asking me to do, but I was uploading it to the app and I got nothing back. I was sending it out, no feedback, teachers didn't say anything about it. It's like sending it into a black box. And then Graham uses the word, he feels entirely subservient to the professionals. And again, I think that's an interesting sort of metaphor, I suppose, that there isn't a sense of partnership there. He says he's doing history stuff because he really loves history and it's part of his work. But he doesn't see that as, he sees it as extra and different to what his kids need to do, and that is being taught by the professionals in the school. So that idea that they feel quite separate from the work that's going on in the schools with their kids. Yeah, and the final bit, and I've not kind of allowed and been able to kind of have much time for this, but I think it's especially important to kind of give some time for a moment to think about how difficult all of this stuff is as non-resident dads. So I had a handful of non-resident fathers in my sample, and just how hard it is for them to be involved, let alone be engaged. So again, this issue of once we went back to school, I was really involved during COVID. Once we went back to some element of normality, I'm just not getting that communication again, despite being really involved before COVID. And that point why does it have to be me that has to sort that out? Why isn't it the mum, and why isn't it the school that has to sort that out? And Simon kind of making a similar point there, that what I don't understand, this is what he's saying, what I don't understand is how the school can't see that if they don't tell me about these great events that are happening, and therefore I don't go, my child thinks that I don't care about them. And how can the school not see that that's having an effect on a pupil in their school? Kind of, some of these quite emotional stories they were telling about the frustrations they have around this. And the final quote there, this idea that and Simon said something similar, really reliant on one person, in this case a school secretary, who said, oh, you're not getting these emails, or you really need to have a second appointment because you can't have the same appointment at parents' evening with your child's mother. I'll do that for you. I'll make sure that happens. So really reliant on one person in the school making a difference, rather than it being something that's kind of embedded in the structures and the processes of school, and very much driven by what the dads can make the effort to do, or someone in school noticing that. And kind of bringing that bit back to Kim's model, those arrows that are going from invitations from others to the parental role construction, where they're not getting those invitations from their spouse and from the school to be involved, it clearly shapes their parental role construction, just because the opportunity is not there for them to breathe confidence, which then kind of gives them that recognition of what they bring to the table that maybe is different to others for their children's education. So, those arrows just don't exist for those dads, and that's a huge frustration. And important, I think, to know from a practitioner's point of view, that school is this site at which many of these tensions around shared parenting really kind of come out, and these dads kind of articulating that really stressful situation when it comes to their involvement. Yeah, so quickly to summarize. So yeah, when there's the opportunity, dads really do it. And certainly the dads in the sample and in the survey, he said they're stepping up and doing it. Confidence makes a difference, but also homeschooling did seem to breed confidence and this important self-recognition that, okay, I can do it in my own way, and that's still quite effective, actually. I can bring in my own interests and I can kind of come up with activities, and that's fine, it's valid. And there is this bedrock, there is this change of work arrangements for many dads, obviously not for all dads, that facilitates this ongoing opportunity for that sort of involvement. But it really comes through as important how important what schools do or don't do, how important that is to breeding dads' confidence in that educational role. So I think, if anything, that realization that it has a direct impact on how dads think about themselves as an educative parent, just those invitations, those opportunities to do things in dad's sort of way. There's a sense that when schools step back in, dads felt that they kind of step back out again. And so there's something about the minimization of the agency that dads have to be involved when schools take on things again in a sort of business as usual approach. And kind of coming back to sort of the literature and the thinking around parental engagement, Janet Goodall and so on. Once we have this school-centered idea of parental involvement, that really feels quite at odds and quite at the other end of the spectrum to a more learning-focused and learning-engaged approach to thinking about fathers' involvement in their children's education and schooling. That they're very engaged in the education, but they might not be that engaged with the schooling. And kind of having an ability to recognize that in schools is important, because otherwise dads feel like they're pushed back out of it when actually they really enjoyed it and they were getting into it during the lockdown. Yeah, so recognition of that from schools would be a key thing, really. Where does that take us? And I won't talk about that, but it was sort of perhaps an orientation to how to do this. Thinking more about complexities of family and fathers' lives, thinking compassionately and thinking about the capabilities and the contributions that dads bring, rather than the risks and the problems and the stereotypes and the assumptions that can sometimes come around sort of this individualized idea of that dad doesn't care, that can sometimes happen. Yeah, and back to some pictures from lockdown at the end.